Hey, thanks for checking out another project video. My name is Mitch and this is Made by Mitch. And today I'm going to show you how I made this walnut desk. So let's check it out. So I'm starting this project off with a few pieces of rough cut walnut. I'm going to mill it down with the planer and then get some straight edges on them for the glue up. I got the boards all planed down. Now I've got to get a straight edge on each side of these boards. So I'm going to get a piece of wood with a factory edge that's straight and clamp it to the side of the board and run my circular saw along that straight edge as a guide to get a straight edge on each of these boards, and then we will glue them up. Cutting the boards this way wasn't ideal, but it worked out okay. And after I got one side straight, I used this rip cut by Craig to straighten up the other side to make them parallel. And I didn't get the cuts perfect, so I had to go in with a hand plane just to make sure everything was square. After I got good edges on all of the boards, it was time to glue them all up. Now I had 4 boards in total, and so I glued up 2 sections of 2 boards using dowel joinery. I used the dowel jig that I made in a former video. I will link that below. And I mainly wanted to use dowels just so that the boards would be lined up properly. You may not need to do this if you have a really tight seam on your glue up. My boards were a little bit warped, so I thought dowels would be the best idea for this. And once I finally got it all together, I used clamps to kind of tighten it up. I had to use a level here just to make sure that they wouldn't bow, and then I just clamped everything together. I did this with 2 different sections, and then what I did was I ran these sections through the planer just to get a smooth surface on both of the sections, and that way the boards were even when I started up the final glue up. In the middle of this I used some super glue to fill in some of these wormholes, which worked out really well. I would recommend this for something like this. Then I can fasten these 2 panels together to make my desktop, and I just used the same doweling method as I did before, just drilling the holes with the dowel jig and then adding the dowels and then clamping them together as tight as I could. Now this was kind of tough to do, but we got there. I did a light sanding, and then it was time to move on to epoxying the top. Now I had some holes and voids in the top that I wanted to add some black epoxy to. So the first thing I did was add the tape there on the bottom just so it wouldn't come out. And then I mixed the epoxy together using some black pigment. Make sure you mix this really well. I didn't get any footage of me mixing this up, but just make sure you get it mixed extremely well when you're doing this. And then I poured it into the different voids and holes in the desk. After pouring, I used a torch to get all the air bubbles out of the epoxy. Okay, so I let the epoxy dry for a few days. A couple quick notes about that is the recommended temperature you're supposed to pour epoxy at is 75 to 85 degrees according to the bottle of the epoxy that I bought. I tried to heat up my shop as much as I could, but I probably only got it to maybe 55 or 60 degrees, and it did take a couple extra days to dry. This is my first time working with epoxy, so I'm not real sure if that has anything to do with the temperature or not. Another thing I wanted to show you is the tape kind of gave way. You can see the tape didn't really hold up that well. I had this on sawhorses, so I think the weight of the epoxy caused the tape to give way. And the result of that is this didn't fill all the way up. There's still some gap and holes right here that I need to add more epoxy. So I'm going to mix up some more epoxy, finish filling these holes up. It's a little bit warmer out now, so I'm hoping that it will dry a little bit better. But things I learned here is whenever you pour epoxy, make sure you have something flat under the table or whatever it is that you're doing, so that way the tape doesn't sag, which is what happened to me. So, all right, let's get this going. The thing I did was I scraped all of this dried epoxy off of the desk. If I were to do this over again, I would be much more careful with the pour. I wouldn't leave this much on the desk because it took a long time to get it off. But I used the chisel, different ways just to try to scrape it off. Then I used a belt sander to sand everything down, and then a straight edge and circular saw to cut the desk to final length. I decided to use a 1/4 inch roundover bit all the way around the desk, and then I could sand everything up to 220 grit. Next, it was time to start working on the leg base of the desk. First thing I did was I cut everything to rough length. I would cut to final length later on, and then I used the jointer just to get one side flat. I would use that flat side against my table saw fence to cut everything to width. While I'm cutting these boards, I wanted to take a second and shout out 2 of my newest patrons over on Patreon. Tony over at Woodworking, and my good friend Chuck. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you've never heard of Patreon before, Patreon is a crowdfunding site that helps content creators like myself. I've just recently joined on Patreon, so if you're interested in my channel at all or want to help support the channel, you can go to my Patreon page. I'll leave links below. But when you join my Patreon community, you'll have access to a lot of behind the scenes information. Every video I put out, I'm going to try to put out a behind the scenes video with that project. And so this desk has a behind the scenes video that's available now. So if you want access to content like that, or you just want to support my channel, check out my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support. All right, now that I got all of my boards cut to a rough width, I'm going to take the faces of them all back through the jointer to get a flat bottom, and then I'll run that through the planer to get my final thickness. All right, now that I got all my boards ready to go, I'm going to run these through the planer. Now I've marked all of the sides I ran through the joiner with an X, so it's my reference side, I know it's flat, so I'm going to put that side on the bottom, then this should be squared with the bottom piece. After I got all the boards to the final thickness, they were ready to start assembling the legs for the desk. And I had a slight angle on the front side of my desk legs, so I had to find that angle, and then I had to measure out where I wanted those to be on the cuts. Now these are going to be different for any desk or any leg base that you do, but this is kind of what I had to do for mine. And so after finding the angle, then I can make all my cuts. The first thing I did was just cut all the boards to size, and then I could start assembling. And I used dowel joinery to assemble all of the leg parts together. This was the best way that I knew how, and really the only way that I had access to, and it worked just fine. I tried to make sure not to drill too deep on these so that way I didn't go clear through the boards, but then I just added my dowels after drilling the holes, and then I put everything into place, and then I clamped all of it together. When I clamped the legs together, I made sure and put the leg of each side, and I clamped them both together. That way they were exactly the same in the glue up. They wouldn't be different, it wouldn't be lopsided or anything like that, and this worked out perfect. After I took them off the clamps, I just sanded everything down really quick, and then I could start working on the boards that would connect the legs together in the base. It got a little bit tricky trying to mark where the dowels would go for these, but I just used the clamp to hold it up, and then I marked where the dowel would go, and then I could drill my dowel holes. Now the board on the front had an angle that would match the angle of the front of my desk, so I put my blade to 10 degrees and I ripped that so it would match that, and you'll see what that looks like right here. I had 3 different boards connecting the legs together, 1 in the front and 2 in the back, and after marking where all the dowels would go, then I could use my doweling jig to drill all the holes for where the dowels would join these legs together. So I got all my dowel holes drilled, ready to glue this thing up. I did go clear through on one of these holes, so I'm going to have to plug that one. But other than that, it looks good. Gluing these on got a little bit tricky. I didn't really have a good way to do it all at once, so first I just laid a leg on the ground, then I tapped the runners in place, and then I put the other leg on top of that and then put it in place as well. Clamping this was also interesting because I didn't have clamps long enough, but I made it work. Okay, so I'm at a bit of a crossroads with this desk. There's a little bit of wobble from side to side. So because of that, I have to make a couple changes. I can either start completely over, which I don't want to do, but after sharing this with one of my friends, he suggested that I put some X bracing on the back side in between the top and bottom piece. So that's what I'm going to do. If you're watching this, Chuck, thanks for the input. So I'm going to mill down some more walnut, the same thickness as what the legs are, and then I'm going to add the X brace to the middle of this. Let's check it out. I first cut these boards to rough length, and then I just laid the desk on top and then marked where the angle needed to be, and then I used this angle finder to figure out what angle I needed to cut these at. And this was an amazing tool. I picked it up just for this and it worked great. It was a perfect fit the first time. I decided I wanted to do a 1/4 inch round over at this point as well, so I went ahead and did this to all the legs. I should have done this before I assembled the legs, but it worked out okay. After doing this to one of the boards, I did the same exact thing for the other, and then I also had the mark on the boards where they would kind of come together.
It was a really weird angle, but I wanted to try to make kind of like a half lap joint where they would stay together. So to do this, I used first a pencil to mark, and then I used the chisel to get a hard line where I would be routing out. And then I just used the trim router to get out most of the material, and then I cleaned it up with a chisel. This wasn't perfect, but for my first time doing this, I was pretty happy with the way that it turned out. But I didn't have a really effective way to attach this to the desk, so I decided to use dowels yet again to do this. And what I did was I drilled clear through the leg, and then I just tapped in some 1/4-inch oak dowels into where I would be putting those. And little tip, if you want to fill in some of these gaps, use sawdust and glue. It makes like a paste that cleans up these edges really nice. And after that, it was time to sand everything. I went all the way up to 220 grit with this desk, and I decided to add in a couple runners in the middle just to strengthen this a little bit. I used the dowel thing again where I drilled clear through the one board into the part I was attaching, and this worked out great for this. I went ahead and dry fit everything together before adding the finish to make sure it would all work out, and to attach this top to the base I used these L brackets. I went back and forth on what to use and decided just to do this because they had them at my local home center. So I just pre-drilled some holes using tape to make sure and not go too deep, and then I just used my impact driver on a really low and slow setting to attach the hardware, and then I just took it back apart, and then it was time to add finish. And you know what I'm probably going to use, because I use the same thing every time. It's my Danish oil. I applied 2 coats of this, letting it dry really well in between coats. And I just love the way Danish oil makes walnut just pop. Make sure you use a tack cloth or something to get all the sawdust off of this before you start the finishing process, which is something that I did and didn't mention. And then after applying the finish, I could attach the top back to the base. Really love the way this project turned out. There were a lot of firsts for me in this project. The angled legs, the dowel joinery like this, epoxy, the X bracing, all these things were new to me, and so I really love the way it turned out. Hopefully you enjoyed this project. I know it was a ton of fun to make.
If you like this video, you may like some of the other projects I've done on my channel. I'll link those right here. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next project.